Welcome to the Field Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bob McNabb, and with me for part 2 of our conversation about leading through risk is Scott Brawner, the president and CEO of Concilium. So, Scott, thanks for being with us here again today. I'm looking forward to jumping back in with you.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, good. So I feel like last time we had some good conversation about kind of the theology of risk and laying some of those foundations. And so I'm looking forward today for us to get into more of the practicals of leading your people both before and during and after crisis situations. And so that, I think, will be very helpful to leaders, because sometimes we just need to know a little bit more brass tacks, what we should be doing or avoiding. And so it should be a good conversation, which, let me just get us kicked off with our first question. What should leaders be doing before workers go and enter high risk or unstable locations? How should we be preparing them, getting them ready for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the greatest misconceptions I have found in mission agencies over the last 30 years is that planning somehow demonstrates a lack of faith, especially in security and risk management. And the reality is the opposite is true. From the Old Testament to the New Testament, faithful leaders are demonstrated as being prepared. From the Old Testament, Noah worked to build the ark. We don't get the plans of how the ark was built, but he had to be diligent towards the building of that ark so that it could survive, floating on the water with all these animals. Joseph, spiritually, is able to interpret dreams, but the interpretation of dreams from that spiritual perspective was irrelevant to the logistics of empowering an entire nation to store its grain, preparing its contingency plan. Nehemiah, it's another one that just comes to mind. He is inspecting the walls before he rebuilds them. He doesn't say, the Lord will raise the walls. In fact, the opposite is true. He says, essentially, our faithful obedience to God to raise the walls, we must be diligent in how we raise them, who will raise them, how the work will be done. And then if we move to the New Testament, Jesus clearly instructs his disciples before sending them out. So I say that because the Bible is clear that preparation is not a substitute for trusting God. It's the way that we demonstrate that we're faithfully obeying him.
Yeah, just seeing it not as a lack of faith, but as something that God directs people to do even. That's good. I think about some business books I've read, and particularly by Jim Collins, where he says, these companies that do well are not the ones who make these big, bold, heroic moves, but they're actually ones who do boring things, like storing up cash reserves for crisis, and so that they're ready when it happens. Those are the companies that do 10 times better than other companies. And so I think, let's not spiritualize and make preparation bad, but how do we do it? How do we help people prepare without making them anxious? We're talking about this might happen, that might happen, preparing them for it. How do we keep them from becoming fearful through the preparation that we're doing?
Yeah, great question, because what I see with many organizations in their preparation is that there seems to be a silo between the preparation that's theological, cultural, cross-cultural training, linguistic training. Because we silo security, that often, for whatever reason, can breed anxiety, when in reality, it should be just as relevant for preparing workers to lead and to live wisely through uncertainty. So wise leaders in general should see preparation as a way to develop judgment and not merely transfer information. And that's really important here, because security training should never be merely about the transfer of information, but how do you help people to develop their judgment towards managing their personal risk? And remember, when we talked earlier, and I'd encourage anyone who hasn't listened to the other broadcast to please do so, is that what's driving the rationale for security and risk management is effectiveness. Because being called to a place is not merely enough. They also need to be effective where the Lord plants them to do ministry. And that's not just protecting yourself from a person with a gun, but back to that cross-cultural stress that we talk about. How are families adjusting?
Yeah.
How's your spouse adjusting? Your children adjusting? Because that has just as much of an impact on the effectiveness of ministry as the security threats. So that being said, the goal isn't to develop security experts, it's to develop wise servants.
Yes.
Another problem that we often have, and I'm speaking as a theologically trained security practitioner, is that we as security professionals often can be our own worst enemy. We can really create problems when we run security training for missionaries in the same way that perhaps we ran security training in the military or law enforcement or in corporate security. I have sat through a lot of training in my years with a security trainer who comes in and tries to use fear to justify the relevance of his training. If you don't listen to me, you're going to die. If you don't listen to me, there'll be bad consequences. The problem with that approach to training is that true love casts out fear. So we don't want to come into training from the perspective of fear. We want to come in from the perspective of love, and understanding then that love protects. Then we look at the practice of risk management, security management, through the lens of love for those who are serving, love for those who are lost. And so it really begs the question, how do I love people well by decreasing my vulnerability to the threats that are on the mission field in order to extend the amount of time of effective ministry I can have in the ministry that God's called me to in this season or in this place?
Right, yeah. Can you be even more specific with us? What specific conversations would be helpful for leaders to have before people get into these crisis situations?
Well, I would start with the worst time to make important decisions is during the crisis itself.
Sure.
The goal is to prepare people both individually for their own personal safety, but also corporately as a team for the realistic contingencies that they could face where they're serving. Every country's a little bit different. Every country has a different risk threshold. So I would start with leaders should have difficult conversations about contingency planning, security management, while everyone's calm, and not in the midst of a critical incident where there's been no conversation and now everyone's trying to do what's right in their own eyes. So those conversations, I find, build trust long before the decisions are actually tested.
I'm thinking about decisions that need to be made sometimes about, do we stay or do we go? And beforehand, talking about what's our threshold? What are the markers? When should we relocate? When should we shelter in place? When should we evacuate? Any guidance you could give the leaders who are listening about how to have those conversations with their team?
Yeah, the process that field workers and leaders use to develop their thresholds or tripwires for departure, like I said, they need to be set in advance. But at the same time, there has to be an understanding that when we reach that point, that there's going to be compliance. Because there's been times where, just recently, I've seen organizations who've set their tripwires who then turn around and say, okay, we've hit the tripwire. Okay, good to know. And then just business as usual continues. And 24 hours, 72 hours later, the airport shut down And now everybody's scrambling to try to get out of a country when they had a window when their tripwire was activated, but then they ignored it. So what you're trying to do as a leader, especially in risk and crisis, is to build margin into decision making. That's why this is so important to have these thresholds for departure, benchmarks for return, is that by processing this before a critical incident, I'm actually now building margin into my decision making, understanding not just what the decision is, but why we made the decision in the first place. Because what often changes under stress and emotion is the why, the rationale for why we have to do this. So that's why I really encourage leaders to have these conversations. And that all comes down to leadership, knowing the difference between choosing to depart, which is a choice, versus needing to flee, which is being forced upon us because we were not prepared, or we ignored our tripwires.
So you seem to be hitting on, some expectations here. It's not just good enough to have the policies written down, but hey, we expect that everyone's going to comply. For example, what other expectations would be important to kind of have clear with everybody?
Well, if leaders are finding that the thresholds that they set are causing personal anxiety, fear, hyper concern, then they need to take time to address that specific situation and take some genuine time to help individuals or families or teams thrive given their current circumstances. That's why creating thresholds and benchmarks is so important, because it helps leaders take measures intended to decrease the vulnerability of our field workers and their families, which allows them to stay, perhaps when threats increase, as they think about the decision-making towards departure, or maybe even seeing the difference between evacuation versus relocation. Can we make the decision to relocate somebody in a country in order to maintain presence and continue the ministry effectively, versus, okay, I've been watching Fox News and the entire world's burning down and we just need to, arbitrarily pull everybody out of a country. We don't want to do that.
Right. So I'm thinking about, you're having these conversations, you're kind of talking things through. Emotions, when it happens, start getting high, maybe some anxiety. It seems like it would be pretty important to have some things written down. And so what do you consider some of the non-negotiable? You at least need to have X, Y, and Z written down. What are some of those things?
Sure. I'll give you quickly 21 key principles or thresholds and benchmarks. In fact, on Concilium's website at concilium.us, there's a resources page, and we have a document called Thresholds for Departure, Benchmarks for Return. Okay. And it lists all of this. So they're there on the website. So please,
and we can put a link
this
to that in the description for our listeners as well.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. So number one is targeted attacks. Has there been any targeting of expats in the city or the countryside in which your people serve in the last 14 days? Okay, this could be kidnapping, this could be murder. In some cases, it might be attacks that have nothing to do with the individual itself. It's just their collateral damage in a broader conflict. When we look across the Middle East right now with missiles flying, they're not looking for Christians. It's a geopolitical issue, and so we're the collateral damage. So yeah, have there been targeted attacks in the last 14 days? Secondly, regardless of the situation I may be facing, is there basic services? Water, sanitation, electricity. If we don't have potable water, then our ministry is not going to be effective. If we don't have sewer, we're going to have a problem with our ministry. Hey, if we have people who need medication that has to be refrigerated and we have no way to keep the refrigerator running, we've got to reevaluate. So those basic services are important. And right behind basic services is food. Are the markets open and basic necessities stocked, or is food now being rationed? Is there price gouging, making food stocks prohibitive in price? Has there been at least 7 days of uninterrupted business with the stores and the vendors? I'm especially looking at through the lens of families and children. If you have to buy certain foodstuffs for children, especially when it comes to infants, if that's not available, we got a real problem. And right up there next to it is fuel. Is fuel available? Is it being rationed? Is there price gouging going on? Does the lack of fuel make ministry prohibitive or daily life prohibitive? That has to be considered. General medical, are basic medical services available? Are the hospitals that the organization typically utilizes, are they open? Are they receiving patients? Are they functional? Personal health, again, back to that medication or medical support. Do they need a resource that has to be replenished regularly? If so, is access to those items available? Are the local pharmacies open, or are there other vendors by which to get the resources that you need? Next one would be communications. Are they better or worse than normal? Are the mobile phones and internet networks up? Are they down? What's causing them to be down? Are they being struck by foreign missiles? Is it vandalism? Has the local government shut them off? If we think about government control and what they're doing or not doing with communications, that can really determine what our next steps for effective ministry are. If we're making a decision to depart or to relocate, all that has to be considered in our communications. Another good one is consular services. We may be able to get food and water, but if the embassy is now closing and somebody loses their passport between now and whenever, they aren't going to get a new passport because the embassy's closed. Well, that's going to have a direct impact on stay-go decision-making. So is the embassy open? Host government concerns. Hey, are senior members of the government fleeing the country? That might be an issue. Our non-essential diplomatic steps. Think about our embassy again. Is the embassy requiring non-essential personnel or families to leave, or is that optional? When it gets to the point where they're making ordered departure decisions, that's when we need to look at a threshold or a tripwire. In the government itself, the local government, is there rebellion or mutiny going on? Where's law enforcement in this? In this rebellion and mutiny, are expats being targeted, or are gospel workers in particular for some reason being targeted in this unrest? Local relationships. Hey, what are our local partners saying? Are they afraid to go out? Are they saying that the situation is dangerous for them? What are they recommending for you? Because it's one thing to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Christ. It's another thing to get them hurt or killed because of the color of our passport. What's driving the threat? Another one would be overland travel safety. And I would also put the international airport in that as well. But, are protesters blocking the roads and restricting travel between cities? In other words, the airport may be open, but if you can't get to the airport because of protests and roadblocks, you may not be going anywhere. Looking at Lebanon as a recent example, and the fact that Hezbollah neighborhoods surround the airport, and the airport could be open and functioning, but if we can't get there, I'd also throw Guatemala into this. I had a time in the last couple of years where we've had perhaps 15 or 20 calls for evacuation, but really what they were looking for was some sort of protection to travel the roads to get back to the airport to fly out. And in some cases, it was actually safer for them to travel out of the country overland and fly out of a second country than to try to drive back to the airport. In the region, are the small regional airports open? If you look at recent events in West Papua in Indonesia with the murder of a missionary pilot and the destruction of his airplane. And if you were relying on mission aviation for evacuation before, and now one of their pilots has been killed and they're no longer flying, what should that be telling you?
Hmm.
at this point. The land border crossings, are they open? I
Yeah.
sort of bring this in for landing. I'm thinking about general safety. And, how does your family feel about their daily routine? Can they go about doing their routine without facing threats or direct hostility? I remember in times in not just Afghanistan, but other countries, Haiti would be another one, where the ministry might be happening, but spouses and children haven't left the house in 6 weeks. And what is that doing
Right.
to the emotional, the good of kids and spouses? And then when they come out for a large event, and you're seeing all sorts of signs of trauma in these kids. And so
Right.
that's got to be
Right.
considered.
Yeah.
Let me end with this: prayer and agreement. This is perhaps the most important one. As leaders, especially home office, field leaders, and our field personnel, do we have agreement in prayer? In other words, when we pray about the same question, are we coming to a similar conclusion? If not, then what's specifically causing the division that needs to be addressed?
Yeah.
That's a big
Yeah.
deal.
Let me, I'm going to try to put a summary statement together after listening to that. And then I want to try to ask the question I think every field leader who's listening is thinking right now after hearing that, and see if I can do that. So what I'm hearing, you mentioned a lot of areas to be attentive to and to keep your eye on these important things. And those are all data points. And so you kind of need to, maybe in each context it's going to be different. And you probably need to identify which of these in our context are the red lines. Which ones, because it may be different in every context. It will be different in every context. All right, so that's a good exercise to do with your team. And I think that should be done and will be helpful to have those kind of conversations. So thanks for sharing those. But now I think the question that probably every worker is thinking is, well, okay, our national partners or the people that we're trying to reach and minister to, they're experiencing all these same things. And so they may not have the luxury of leaving, like if we consider pulling out, but they don't have that. What is it going to do to our credibility if we pull up and leave every time one of our tripwires gets hit? How is that going to impact our long-term ministry? And how do we make a wise decision that doesn't really hurt us in their eyes? How do you wrestle with that tension?
It's a fair question that needs to be addressed by every organization because it's messy. Part of this is looking at the broader context of who the organization is trying to support, who the organization is trying to protect. Using these high threat environments, Afghanistan, Haiti. Again, you could be out doing ministry, but if your family is suffering as a result, then the question has to be addressed, what's best for my first ministry? Because by the way, if we're saying that our first ministry is our family and we're willing to sacrifice our family, which sometimes that's necessary, but we've got to answer the question, what's worth risking and why? That's why theology of risk becomes so important. But it's also the theology of suffering that has to be considered in this. And I'll give you a practical example of this. Okay. You've got a husband who says, to his wife, I will die before I let you be assaulted. And that makes him feel good. Again, this is all just philosophical right now because there's no attack happening. But then the wife turns and looks at her husband and says, yeah, but if you resist and get killed, I'm still going to be assaulted, and now I'm a widow. I want you to be here with me so that I can recover. So the husband looks at his wife and says, you don't want me to protect you? And she says, no, I didn't say that. I just don't want you to die. Which means that family has to make a decision. At what point do you stop resisting? At what point do you make a decision for what's best for your family? Now, you take that to, I don't want to leave my local partners because every time, there's a bad report, we're getting up and leaving. Then yeah, I'd say if that's the way your organization is running, then you need to reevaluate your theology of risk. And inside that theology of risk, the benchmarks and tripwires that are driving this departure. But just as importantly, I think we have to look at what's actually causing us to stay, and are we accepting consequences that in the long term are not going to be acceptable, especially when it comes to the long-term health and growth of our children. And what I mean by that is I have far too many, probably just in my mind right now, 15 examples in the last 10 years of missionary kids, third culture kids who have come home and have, abandoned the faith as a result of traumas suffered on the mission field. I've got specific examples of those who came back, and not only through critical incident stress debriefings, but through long-term counseling, identified. So again, I'm not here to tell an organization what to do or not to do. What I am trying to encourage is to count the cost beyond just staying for the sake of our local partners, especially when we have to think long-term about our children.
So what I'm hearing is you can't let it all be like, well, our partners can't leave, so we should never leave. No, there are times you should leave. There are there's things you should consider. At the same time, you need to consider your local partners. You need to consider those you're ministering to and credibility issues. And so you've got to consider both of those. I think about a tragic circumstance I'm familiar with where a worker was assassinated, and the rest of the people on that team entered some conversations with locals that they had built relationships with. And those locals actually rallied around them and protected the rest of the team. So what a sweet situation when you developed, a loving relationships with local people around where they become your protectors. And I think having conversations with them about, seeking their advice, I believe, not just making a decision, but entering conversation with people like that. Hey, what do you think we should do? Any input that you would have for us? If you do need to make a tough decision to pull out, at least they felt like they had a chance to counsel and speak in. And so I think that can be one of the ways to mitigate concerns about things, is allow it to be a conversation with the people you're concerned about offending or losing credibility with, and allow them a voice in it. But any thoughts on that before we move on?
No, absolutely. Look, what I'm trying to do in any of these situations with the leadership of an organization, dealing with field personnel that are in crisis, is I'm first trying to understand their theological maturity. And that's assessing how well leaders and personnel are integrating biblical understanding with disciplined decision-making in complex situations. How well are they integrating that biblical understanding with a disciplined approach to decision-making? Mature theology reflects a balanced understanding of calling, suffering, and stewardship. In fact, I would even say at this point, I think Anna Hampton has written some good stuff on this. I've done some great partnership and some writing with her. And one of the things that she's touched on is what happens when field personnel answer risk questions with suffering answers. Let me give an example. This is one of my, this actually happened, okay? There's a growing kidnapping threat in a location. And so I'm asking the question, what are you doing to decrease your vulnerability to the kidnapping threat in this area? Response, we're trusting God through the flames. Oh, okay. Thank you for your faithfulness to the Lord to be obedient to serve. But back to my question, what are you doing to decrease your vulnerability to the threat? and they look at you kind of strange. I just told you, I'm trusting God through the flames. Say, that didn't answer the question. You're giving a suffering answer to a risk-based question. And rephrasing the question, what are you doing to be obedient to God's call by stewarding well your safety in order to remain faithful and effective in this season? And now, so this is why this theological maturity is being tied often to what we call spiritual maturity. But keep in mind, you can never have spiritual maturity apart from emotional maturity. That's why this is so complex, and why we see security training is not just about trying to impart information, but teaching people how to make wise decisions.
As you were talking about how people might, give the answer that they're trusting God through the flames, I was thinking about Nehemiah when the threat came. He didn't just say, well, we're trusting God through no, he posted watchmen, and they had, walking around with swords, and but they didn't quit the work. They didn't just say, we're done, we're leaving. But they did the prudent things. And there are times when that's the right thing to do. And there are times when you should get in a basket and be let down out of a window and get the heck out of there, right? There are different actions that are appropriate during different times. And knowing what to do is usually much easier when you have solid facts to do that, to base those decisions on. But field reality is that we as leaders often don't have real clear facts. Things are evolving, emerging, and things are a little fuzzy, and they're rumors, and you don't know what's exactly the case. I think about the first coup that we experienced in the country where I was serving, and it's one of our national people that we're ministering to. Well, several of them came over to our house, and we're in the middle of the coup, and they said, Bob, the government, the soldiers are down there killing people, and they're trying to hide it. They're taking the people down to where there's a crocodile farm, and they're feeding the corpses to crocodiles to get rid of the evidence. And there's just one kind of fantastic rumor after the next. We're flying around. Okay, so now you're leading in a situation where everything's not clear. You've got your tripwires written down, you've talked about them, but you don't know if you're hitting them or not exactly. Things are a little fuzzy. What guidance would you have for leaders in those circumstances?
Security and crisis management is relationship management. And in any of these cases, we're trying to manage relationships in areas that are entirely subjective, based on the experience, background, worldview, and understanding of the individual involved. It has to do with their risk tolerances versus their risk capacities. Or like you said with your first coup, and they're throwing bodies to the crocodiles. Did that probably happen where one or two people? Yeah. Were they just taking thousands of bodies and throwing them to the crocodiles? Probably not. But what allows you to have the discernment to process through that information that you're receiving? Again, some people have the ability to do that, and some people may not. And again, that's why, especially in leadership, that relationship management becomes so important. And in the emotion of the moment, can I trust the voices that I hear? There's so much noise and there's so many voices. How do I learn to discern God's voice in the midst of all the voices of my day, especially in the midst of crisis? So that's why I'm always trying to encourage leadership to remember, look, leadership requires humility, and we need to listen first to what people are saying, even if it's totally off the rails, and then advise second. And some of this comes back to just good old-fashioned duty of care. You mentioned earlier, as we were talking about stay-go decisions and, what's this going to do long-term to my relationships with my local partners? We got to remember that sometimes the safest operational decision isn't the wisest ministry decision. And it takes wisdom to sort through that. And because in this moment of these hard decisions, I rarely try to frame them as right or wrong. It's actions that lead to consequences. And I'm looking at that not only when the emotion comes for stay go, but also for the return. And even especially a wise leader is looking at this not just in the moment, but in the long term of recovery. And is there a way to manage this relationship well so that we can recover well, so that making the decision whether to stay or go doesn't lead to somebody terminating and coming off the field who otherwise, should stay on the field. That's a challenge as well.
Yep. And I'm thinking about how you can have these well-laid plans. You've talked through everything with your team. And then when things actually start happening, there's always the question mark of how much of that is going to be easily accessible in their minds, in their notebooks, I'm thinking about, I've got at least four fire extinguishers in this house that we moved into. If a fire broke out, would I know where those are? Without reviewing or thinking about, it's been 3 years since I've thought, I walk by them every day and don't even recognize them, or like I don't think about them. And so I'm just thinking like, if a fire broke out, I probably would not remember where they are. I'm thinking there's a reason that we have fire drills at elementary school at different places so that it stays fresh in people's minds, or where's the notebook? If something happens, we got it all written down somewhere. So I'm just thinking about what kind of rhythms should teams have to review the things they've talked through, to freshen up on them so that when it happens, they're not caught flat-footed.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've literally seen in reviewing contingency plans that were now 10 years old, and the people who wrote them aren't even on the field. In fact, the entire team that was there is no longer on the field, and it's a brand new team. And often context determines meaning, and the new team doesn't have the context for the why they were going to be doing what they were doing. Using the house fire as an example, right? Contingency planning is intended to help build margin into decision-making. For example, the margin for decision-making comes when we meet before a fire ever happens and says, in the event of a fire, this is how we're going to get to safety, maintain accountability, and ultimately call for help. So that no matter where you're at in the house, likely in your bed asleep when you smell something, and you may be going out a window, you may be going out the front door, but either way, we know where we are supposed to quickly gather to get accountability. We call that an assembly point, a fire assembly point. So the margin is the fact that we discussed it and came up with a plan. So now I'm using contingency planning to forecast actions or behaviors where there is no communication. Because when a fire breaks out in the middle of the night, you're going to say, okay, team, what do we want to do? No, it's the opposite. It's like every man for himself, essentially, to try to get out of the house. Now, here's the problem. If we have no plan in place and we're coming out of the house and we don't even know where to meet, emotion takes over. The father realizes that his young daughter isn't with the group. And so he runs back into the house, risking his life to find his daughter, not realizing that she made it out safely and was now standing in the backyard by herself instead of in the front yard with the family. So he is risking his life based on an emotional reaction to not seeing his daughter when the reality is she's actually safe. Right? That's why we build margin into decision-making and contingency planning by saying, let's think this through. What do we plan to do? That way we can quickly gain accountability and then determine next steps in a crisis. That's just with a fire. Well, car accident, detainment. If our team leader doesn't make it out and gets detained and the rest of us are able to go, because often it's the leader that has all that information because it's so much easier just to hold it yourself and to do it yourself. But what happens, when the greatest source of your strength is also the first point of failure? That's why contingency planning becomes important, because What happens if the team leader gets detained and now the rest of us are all standing out here, waiting to go through the double doors of destiny, into 5,000 of our new closest friends who are all standing there with signs waiting on somebody?
Yeah.
Who are we actually meeting?
Yeah, this brings up a couple of things. I'm hearing communication, obviously, the importance of establishing communication rhythms during crisis and what those should look like. But I have fresh in my brain this little documentary I watched yesterday about a Northwest Airlines flight of 747. And they had a rudder that went hard left and was stuck there. And that's like a leader. The rudder is going to direct the direction that this whole plane goes. And this rudder became non-functional. And they actually were able to land that plane safely. And the reason is because a unique design of the 747 is they have two rudders. And so they were able to use the other rudder. So there was redundancy, there was a backup. And I'm thinking about the importance, like you said, your strength can be in having a leader who's prepared and thinks well, but the importance of who's the co-leader if that leader's not available? Who's the backup? And having this not be something that just one person is in charge of, but having some good redundancy plans in place as well. So let me back up. That was more of a statement than a question. My question is about the communication rhythms. What would be some good communication rhythms to have?
First of all, setting the expectation that we're going to do this. Look, it doesn't matter what your policies and procedures are if you don't have the culture to back it up. So as you're developing the culture, and in order to have your processes and procedures in place, is we have to have the expectation that we're going to do this. Like we are going to create a contingency plan, that there's going to be expectation that the contingency plan is filled out, that there's going to be accountability if it's not done. So as a new person in the pipeline going to the field, they need to understand in the same way that there's finance expectations, like you have to raise so much money before you're able to deploy, those policies and procedures that just seem so natural to us. We need to put our security policies, procedures, and planning into the same mindset as our finances and our administration. That's a culture issue and ultimately then a compliance issue. Okay. Then I can start setting the tempo for what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, and how we're going to do it. Every country is a little bit different. Where are we going to the Middle East or are we going to Latin America? What are the threats? And then, by the way, that goes back to the risk assessment. Have we actually assessed what the threats are so that we can identify our vulnerabilities to the threats? So yeah, helping people to develop that tempo of saying, before I get to a country, before I deploy, I'm going to do my research. I'm going to put that into a paper. When I was running the fusion program at Midwestern Seminary, deploying high school and college kids, well, really, they're freshmen in college, I would have them write one paper that was identifying the threats in the country that they were going to serve. And they would have to present their papers. And then I'd have them write a second paper on how to decrease their vulnerability to the threats that they identified in that country. Well, what have you done? Well, you've actually helped them to count the cost of obedience. And making that requirement and tying it to a grade, by the way, that's the best part. Really what you've done is to help them better count the cost because they understand the consequences of actions. That's the whole point of Jesus saying count the cost. It's not just what could possibly happen, but what is the impact? What is it going to cost you, if you succumb to the risk? So again, number one in that rhythm is developing the culture, because without the culture, they're not going to do it. Secondly, then is developing a process of what we're going to identify, what we're going to create. And third is the expectation that this is going to be completed. And then finally, fourth is the compliance and the consequence if we don't.
Yeah. And I really like what you said about having the students write these papers themselves. I think that goes back to the illustration of the fire extinguishers in my house. If I had installed those myself, I would probably know right where they are, and I wouldn't have this issue of, now, where are those? But when someone else, installed them and I inherited them, that's very different. I don't have ownership. And so you have people that you can't just pass down, here's the policy manual, and expect them to have buy-in and be fresh on it and act on it and remember it. And so I think that covers a multitude of problems when you have people involved in kind of establishing the rhythms of the practices, the policies, themselves is a good thing that came out of that. But I think we've talked about preparing people before they go. We've talked about some of the realities of when something's going on and leading through that. I'd like to kind of start landing the plane by asking, all right, so the crisis is somewhat over, and what should we be doing as leaders after the crisis to help people process, recover, learn, and re-engage wisely?
Yeah, let me start that as we think about landing the plane here. I like how you put that. Start with 3 simple questions as you prepare. 1, do we know what we're trying to protect? Secondly, if a critical incident happens today, who makes which decisions? And then thirdly, once we get the plan written, when was the last time that we actually practiced the plan or reviewed the plan? Those 3 steps are critical to how you will debrief a critical incident and its impact on your field workers. Because duty of care begins with the duty to warn, and it kind of goes back to making those kids write those papers, because really what you're doing is you're warning them of the threats, but you're making them internalize it as a result. So that's part of the key critical duty of care is duty to warn. That's one part of the handshake of the duty of care. That's essentially the leadership to the field. But the other side of that handshake from the field to the leadership is duty to trust or duty to comply. And so now in the duty to trust, if we're going to move into a debriefing, has the field worker been able to trust us and develop a sense of trust with the leaders who help them walk through this critical incident, regardless of what the critical incident could be? Because look, as much as we worry about kidnapping, the number one killer of missionaries is car accidents. So how have we, in the response to a car accident, that may have led to the death of team members, how did we do in not just recovering the individual who was lost and, are we burying that person in the country? Are we repatriating them back to the state? How did we manage the member care towards the family, towards team members? Or if we were to take this, and this is another real example, a kidnapping, and with now the decision to pay ransom or not to pay ransom. And in particular, because I don't want to get into specifics of any cases, but let's say it's not the field worker that's been taken, it's a local partner who works on behalf of the organization. And now the organization, again, this actually happened, the organization has a no ransom policy and says, this is terrible, it's bad, but we're not going to pay. And it's $5,000, $5,000 USD. And so the family is working to raise the $5,000, even though the individual who was kidnapped was working on behalf of the organization when they were taken, but the organization isn't going to pay. And by the way, this is when my phone rings. They had like $4,200. And the question was being raised, should we give the $800 to complete the ransom demand to return the person safely? And they were going around over the ethics of, we have a policy that we don't pay ransom. Do we give the $800? So I took that to the next logical conclusion is, what's going to be worse for the organization? Paying the $800 or the impact of moral injury on your team members when this guy dies for $800? What's going to have the greater impact on trust? What's going to have a greater impact on hope? What's going to have the greatest impact on the respect of the field to the leadership, knowing that someone who they loved working on behalf of their organization died for $800? And so they came up with a plan to not pay a ransom, but because the person had been held for like 60 days, and hadn't been paid their salary. Well, how much is their salary? Well, that's about $800 plus or minus. So now don't pay the ransom, but hey, why don't you pay his salary to his family for the 2 months that he's been gone at $800, and they can do with the money what they want. So now the organization leadership get to keep their integrity, so to speak, intact, that they didn't have to pay the ransom at $800. The family gets the $800 necessary. They get the money together. They return, and indeed, that he was successfully released. And now the field avoids the moral injury and actually gets to celebrate and rejoice in God's faithfulness that this person was returned. So now, to your point, the debrief begins. And how appreciative and thankful and honorable the organization leadership has been. Because, by the way, the field doesn't need to know about that deep philosophical conversation that they were going to let that dude die for $800.
Well,
to walk through that.
Obviously, they were wrestling with, does our paying endanger other people? So not an easy decision.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Oh, sure. All of that it's right. Not an easy decision. But that's the whole point, right? Because now when you go into the debrief, imagine going into that debrief saying, well, the organization was asked to give $800. We chose not to give the $800 and this guy died. How's that debrief going to go? Here's another example. Again, these are all real examples. This isn't just philosophical. Right. This is real. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and stay-go decisions. I had one in Poland did this debrief, and you had some of the people who wanted to leave weeks earlier and stayed because they felt this pressure and guilt from other team members, although they wanted to leave weeks earlier. And then
the culture's so important.
That's right.
Okay, go ahead.
And some were forced to leave, and they didn't want to leave because they were living in Western Ukraine and there was nothing going on. And so in the debriefing, you had people at each other's throats, angry at each other, angry at the leadership, lack of leadership, lack of communication, and it was a train wreck in the debrief. Now, ultimately, people were able to reconcile and get back on the field, but for about 12 to 14 weeks, it was a tough time in that team.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is just being aware that situations need to be debriefed. You know, not just kind of brushing over it and, everybody's okay, But no, there's probably some relational, emotional, psychological, possibly even spiritual damage and wounds that have been incurred. And so I think knowing that it needs to be done, and then getting communication started and with humility, then people can come out the other side healthy. But Scott, this has been a good conversation. I want to give you one last shot at our leaders that are listening, and would love to ask for our leaders who are listening and realizing that this is bringing up a lot of areas where I think we're unprepared. I don't know that we've really done our due diligence and getting everybody ready. And I want to be a better steward, and I want to prepare my team and my area. What can that person do? What are some first steps that they should take to get on the right track?
Understand that the practice of security risk management is faithful stewardship. Security and crisis management will never be about mastering procedures. It's going to be about shepherding people faithfully through uncertainty. And if you can get that through your mind and into your heart, walking through crisis, or even before crisis, managing security, it's about shepherding people faithfully through uncertainty. Our calling in leadership is not to eliminate every risk, but it's to remove unnecessary barriers to faithful and effective gospel ministry. So, and by the way, I should probably tell you now, we've got a great critical incident debriefing guide in both English and Spanish, and it's free. And it's probably, oh gosh, I don't even know how many pages it is, probably 20 pages. And it's got key questions and, places to fill it in. And it's a really great resource. And all this is available on our website for free. I want people to be equipped so that they can see that preparation is an act of faith and not an act of fear.
Amen. And I'm sure if someone wanted more training, they could reach out to Concilium. If they wanted consulting, you guys do that as well. I know you also provide briefs on your take, your information on how things are in particular hotspots in the world. Those have always been very helpful to me when I was leading teams in different places. So a wealth of things you guys offer. And again, we'll have the link to the website and the couple of specific resources in the description. So anyway, thanks, Scott. Been a good couple of episodes. Appreciate you sharing with us.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. And I hope and sincerely pray that what's been shared in these last two podcasts would not just help organizations to keep from being sued, but it could empower the lost to be saved in every language, people, tribe, and nation.
All right. Well, this has been an episode of the Field Leaders Podcast, a part of the Missio Nexus Podcast Network. Leaders, you are not alone. We're here to help you learn, grow, connect, and collaborate. God bless.